Hi, I'm Sheila Kuehl. Welcome to Get Used to It. As you may know, if you watch the show, we have spent the years talking about a lot of issues of interest, not only to the gay lesbian community, but hopefully to everybody. But this one today, I think, is something even more special, because today we're going to talk about the death penalty. It's been interesting to me and to a number of people how discussion of the death penalty has sort of come back a little bit more into public consciousness. The legislature of New Hampshire voting to abolish it, though the governor of that state vetoed that statute. The governor of Illinois having some second thoughts about the death penalty. Newspapers, magazines, some discussion going on. So I wondered, what could we add, if anything, in our show from the point of view of our gay and lesbian community and our broader participation in the world. So I've invited three brilliant, wonderful, involved people to come and talk today with us about it. First is Jenny Pizer, who is the managing attorney of the Lambda Legal Defense and Education Fund, Western Regional Office. Welcome, Jenny. Happy you're here.
Delighted to be here.
Thank you. Jay Kohorn, who's the assistant director of the Los Angeles office of the California Appellate Project, which supervises court appellate counsel for indigent defendants who are appealing not only death penalty cases, but others, but a significant number of death penalty cases here in California. Welcome, Jay.
Nice to be here, thanks.
And our third guest is Torie Osborn, who is the executive director of the Liberty Hill Foundation, one of the most progressive foundations in the country, funding grassroots organizing and other wonderful things. Torie is also, as I think many of us have seen watching this show, longtime activist and brilliant thinker on social issues. So rounding out the panel, welcome, Torie.
Glad to be back.
Glad you're here. Jenny, I'd like to start with you, because we had a situation that really stirred not only our community, but people in our community a lot, with the death of Matthew Shepard. And defendants were apprehended and tried. And I know that there was some cry, they killed him, let's kill them. But also, I think, some ambivalence in our community about it. Did Lambda have a stand on this or any experience with this?
Yes, actually, Lambda was very involved. As you said, when Matthew was murdered, the whole country was shocked, and I think many people in the gay and lesbian community felt a very personal loss and great emotions in reaction to the arrest and the prosecution and the announcement by the prosecutor that these two defendants, that the death penalty would be sought. And that posed a question to Lambda, because generally we don't take positions on a range of issues. We do our work through our cases and through advocacy, but we don't take positions sort of in general on issues. But in this instance, the death penalty and the appropriateness in this horrible, horrible case was posed, that question was posed to the whole country. And we felt that it was important to take some leadership and to try to outline some of the key civil rights issues that are posed in every instance where the death penalty is requested. And so Lambda formulated a position and came out as strongly as we possibly could against the death penalty, not just in that case, but in all cases, for a number of particular reasons. But we did feel like in that instance where the murder victim was a gay man, and it was such a horrible anti-gay crime, that it was particularly important that our voice be heard. The reasons we did that are pretty straightforward. First of all, we know that the legal system has enormous fallibility. Mistakes are made all the time. And in fact, that's a significant part of our work. As a civil rights organization dealing with homophobic bias in society and in the courts, we know that there are mistakes and that there's bias. There's bias from the US Supreme Court, as we all saw in 1986 with the Georgia sodomy decision, the Bowers against Hardwick decision. The court didn't mince words. They said our claim to the same privacy right that everybody else takes for granted was facetious, and that we could be treated as less than everybody else. Well, we see that in every court, coast to coast, state and federal. It's a real problem. And it's a real problem when it comes to criminal trials and the death penalty in particular.
But here we had the right guys. right? I mean, they really were the murderers. It was a heinous crime. Just for the retribution factor alone, I think people say, well, we got them, we're not worried about whether they did it, why shouldn't it be an eye for an eye? And I think in that case it was also instructive in terms of what Matthew Shepard's parents said. Were they involved with Lambda at all in this this decision?
They really weren't. I mean, we approached it as civil rights lawyers. I mean, and of course all of our legal work takes place in the social context. We were aware of what his parents were saying and the rest of the country was saying, but we focused on the way the legal system operates. And in particular, it's very important that rules be applied fairly and accurately, especially in a situation as with the death penalty, where if you make a mistake, it is an irreversible mistake. And if it cannot be applied fairly, then it shouldn't be applied at all. We could hypothesize what the world would be like, and we're always working every day for a world that won't be so poisoned by bigotry. But the world we have today, it's terribly poisoned. And our position for a long time, and this is part of why we spoke out in this instance, is that the way to cure hate violence, including its most extreme form, murder, is through education. You can't bring Matthew Shepard or any other murder victim back by the most extreme sanction being imposed on the murderer. But what you can do is put society's resources and attention into reaching young people at the earliest ages and teach them that we all have to live together. I think the country as a whole learned some of that lesson with some of the hideous crimes that have happened in our schools in the past couple of years. We really have to start young. And so, you know, there are roles for hate crimes laws. That's a big subject. But, you know, there are certainly roles for hate crimes laws in being a statement of society's values, and that an attack on somebody based on their identity is damaging to the victim and also to everyone else who's a member of that group. That's certainly true. But we mustn't ever think that those criminal laws do the teaching work. They don't. I mean, all the studies show that they don't. In fact, we see in the states that have the death penalty, the murder rate doesn't go down. In fact, it's higher. The best example of that may be Texas. I think the country as a whole has been looking carefully at some of the statistics coming out of Texas recently, and that's case in point. So violence doesn't, I mean, if we use the extreme sanction of the death penalty, it doesn't cause the rate of murder to go down.
You know, I agree with you personally. I oppose the death penalty, and I have never thought it served a deterrent. But since I listen to a lot of constituents and my colleagues and their constituents, this is a real visceral issue for people, where it seems like teaching like this has to really sort of overcome this gut feeling. And I thought it was instructive, if we're talking about just being vindictive or punishing, that Matthew Shepard's parents themselves did not want the death penalty to be imposed. Yeah. They did not feel that was an appropriate sanction. So how are we going to be more vindictive than the parents of the men who were killed? But an interesting thing has happened about hate crimes, which is this notion that in order for us to have full equality, we have to at the very least be treated the same as other minority groups. And we had an interesting situation in California, I know you know, where only some groups, if they're victims, do the murderers face the death penalty. With other groups like ours, they didn't. Can you talk a little about that? Sure.
Well, the law in California until last year was that murders based on race, national origin, religion, a couple of other color, a murder motivated in significant part by the identity of the victim, if it was one of those characteristics, there was a special circumstance that could warrant imposition of the death penalty. Last year, Wally Knox introduced a bill, maybe 208, I think it was, that addressed sexual orientation, gender, and disability. If a murder was based on that aspect of a person's identity, there should be a special circumstance as well. Well, there was an interesting tension within the gay and lesbian community on that issue, because many people feel passionately opposed to the death penalty. Other people felt similarly passionately that there should be equality, and if you're going to have that special circumstances law, it should be equal. because certainly what would California be saying to say that it was a worse crime to murder somebody based on race than based, say, on gender, disability, or sexual orientation? Because people have so many complex feelings, there wasn't strong community support for a bill to add an equal special circumstances penalty. And instead, the law that passed and was signed by the governor and is now on the books in force in California provides for life without possibility of parole if there's a murder motivated, again, by sexual orientation, disability, or gender. I think what that tells us is that, as we see so often, we're a very diverse community, people with passionate feelings. Many of us felt deeply injured, for example, by Matthew Shepard's murder. It didn't feel like it was just him. And so while his parents' statement of what they wished, which was education and healing and growing for society, which was a wonderful message, there were many who felt that injury personally and wanted retribution, as you said. And people have felt that way in California too. But we are a community of people because, perhaps anyway, because we live with discrimination and many types of verbal and physical harassment. People feel a need for protection. And that's why the passage of the law in the form that it took, I think, probably gave a lot of people some measure of comfort. It didn't make everybody happy, but, you know, few things do.
Didn't make anybody happy. Jay, it's interesting to me. It's always been interesting. I've known you for years, the work that you have chosen to do. Now, I understand that appellate work covers more than death penalty cases, but you've supervised some attorneys who've done death penalty cases, and it must be a matter of discussion in CAP endlessly, I'm sure. How does it feel to do this work? I'm sure you have personal feelings about the death penalty as well.
How does it feel to do this kind of work? I think if you look at the number of people on death row, which in California is about 570, and you look at how many lawyers aren't willing to do this kind of work, it's very instructive. There are over 200 people on death row who don't have attorneys. They don't have attorneys, one, because the work is so difficult that it takes a special level of attorney, more than a common level of expertise to be able to do it. But the other thing is, it's very, very hard. If the death penalty isn't cruel or unusual to the client, maybe it is to the attorneys, because you spend years of your life focused on helping someone who ultimately could be put to death, and the compensation doesn't make up for what you, I mean, there's an amazing amount of money that people put into these cases themselves. It's very, very difficult. So the attorneys that, in my Northern California office especially, who work on these kinds of cases, and the attorneys in the private sector who work with those attorneys, are among the most dedicated, hard-working attorneys for very little compensation. But they are, to a person, I think, dedicated to making sure that people have a fair chance. Part of the reason that attorneys, good attorneys, are needed at the appellate level is because, and maybe, I don't know, maybe most people don't know this, when you're convicted of a crime that is death qualifiable, you have to go through two trials. One determines your guilt, and the other determines your punishment. So let's say that you've been convicted and you are deemed guilty of a homicide that qualifies you for the death penalty. Then another jury, another trial, determines whether you get one of two punishments in California, either death or life without possibility of parole. And life without possibility of parole, I think most people in California don't realize it, is really life without possibility of parole. And most people who go through this process end up getting life without possibility of parole, which is a gigantic fiscal drain on the system. We'll talk about that in a little while. But
do you mean the trial is, or the imprisonment?
Both.
Well, isn't that though why, I mean, some people say, why should we spend all of this tax money on people who should be put to death?
Right.
I mean, I was thinking, you go to a cocktail party, and I don't know what's worse, if you come out as a gay man or you come out as somebody who's
Favors abolishing the death penalty.
favors
right.
abolishing the death penalty and actually works, you know, in the area.
Try both.
Yeah, really. It's a double whammy.
Right. No, I mean, you're right. What most people don't realize is, number one, it is tremendously expensive to have the death penalty. And people think that you can just get rid of the safeguards and the price goes way down. The part of the expense is the double trial, which is mandated by law. It's not a matter of the habeas corpus appeals or anything, which people would like to truncate, but it's just a tremendously expensive trial procedure. And as I said, most people don't get the death penalty ultimately. The appellate process is interesting though, because if we try to eliminate that expense, as the legislatures in some states and the federal government is trying to do by limiting how much habeas corpus is available, we will start executing innocent people. Approximately 1 out of every 100 on death row is found to be innocent, actually innocent, and it usually takes about 7 years to discover that. So if you bring habeas corpus down to 2 or 3 years, you have to be willing in that process to start executing innocent people.
You know, there's also a cost. I don't know whether it's a weight on the heart or whatever, but one of my feelings about the death penalty has always been that it's hard on society. I mean, people think it's the right thing to do, they think it's an appropriate punishment, but it never makes you feel joyful. I mean, maybe a few weirdos, but...
Yeah, I've been concerned about that. Sometimes they think it's the right thing to do. Let's go to that for a second, because it's the religious, you know, the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not kill, all of that kind of stuff. The definition of thou shalt not kill in Hebrew translates to thou shalt not murder. So that takes care of people who are, did you know that? That's not,
no.
It's not thou shalt not kill. If you actually kill somebody in war, for example, it's not a violation of the 10 Commandments, arguably, because the proper translation is thou shalt not murder. But I went to my rabbi and asked him what the Jewish position on, and the historical religious position, therefore, on the death penalty was. And he said there are all sorts of occasions where people are put to death in the Bible. It's not necessarily frowned upon. It's not something that is seen as bad. The death penalty is very much alive and well biblically. And I sort of looked quizzically at him and I said, well, a lot of Jewish people are against the death penalty. What's that all about? And he said that in the early days of the first rabbis and the writing of the Talmud and some of the biblical books and the early rules, while the rabbis recognized that the death penalty was possible and viable, they didn't have a stomach for it. So they created rules, procedural rules, that basically ensured that it would never be used. And they did. I mean, you have to have eyewitnesses, you can't have circumstantial evidence at all, and some of the witnesses, the actual witnesses, have to be willing to commit the execution. I mean, there are all sorts of safeguards that ensure that it doesn't happen. So my obvious question was, well, what about Eichmann, who was taken to Israel and executed? And his answer was, when Eichmann went, there was a ruling from the Supreme Court of Israel that told the political establishment there that the execution of Eichmann under Jewish law would not be possible. There were no eyewitnesses. So according to Jewish law, it could not happen. They threw it back into the prime minister's lap, and said, if there's going to be an execution, it has to be a political decision. It cannot be a legal or religious decision, because religion and politics say no, religion and Jewish law says no. So the Prime Minister wrote all over the world, got responses. You can imagine lots of responses said, please don't do it. And he ultimately did it, as you know. And his rationale was, well, while a lot of leaders of the world was telling me not to, I had the 6 million Jews who were executed whispering in my ear that it had to be done. But that was his decision. I would love to have had him take a higher road. But I thought it was interesting to know what the biblical...
Well, it is, and I think this theme of ambivalence seems to run through a lot of the discussion of the death penalty. And Torie, I wanted to ask you to sort of pick up this theme a little bit in terms of what you've heard, because you've been active certainly in our community, executive director of the center and of the task force, and now in the, I guess we'd say, either the broader community or another community in terms of economic justice and other kinds of social justice. This has been a tough one, not for you necessarily, because I know your feelings on it, but why do you see this coming up as a topic of discussion now? An admission of the ambivalence, maybe.
Well, I like to think it's because we're at the beginning of another surge of kind of activism and questioning of, you know, dominant ideas that are taken as truth and as and eternal correctness. And as you know, I really think that the last 20 years, there's been a real control over the kind of terms of political and social debate and of kind of economic theory by the right wing in this country. And so I think there's been very little space for any real wrestling with issues. And I always like to, you know, I sort of thank the right wing for putting morality on the agenda, because I think ultimately those of us, and I mean the rest of us who have lots of different views, but it's probably about 70% of the people, you know, won't ever line up with the right wing on most issues. I think there's this kind of enduring majority of Americans who favor, you know, right to choice and gay and lesbian rights, at least in a limited way, and a whole set of issues, kind of environmental protections and public education that's more robust and much more economic opportunity than what we've been allowed. Now, I'm not so sure on the death penalty, and this is what I think is very interesting. What I think is interesting, that because the issue of morality, and I like to think it's because it's a deeper question. When you said it hangs heavy on your heart, I can't tell you how significant that is. I think the conversations happen at these kind of other levels. I was sitting around a swimming pool on July 4th with about 20 lesbian activists, members of my kind of family and then friends, who I've known, many of them, for 20 and 25 years. These are names people would recognize. These are people who have a track record of working for social justice within the women's movement, within the gay and lesbian community. We started to talk about this issue, and I want to tell you, there were 4 of us out of 20 who were against the death penalty. And one of us was kind of on the fence, and the rest of the people were against it, including one.
No, we're for it.
I mean, we're for it. I'm sorry. We're for the death penalty, unambiguously, unambivalently, including one woman who said, let me get a chance to pull the switch. Oops. And what I saw come out of her face, now, you know, I read auras, I have a little bit of that lesbian witchy thing, but, you know, something happens when people talk in favor of the death penalty, not in a reasonable discussion, but, and then that day, then I went to the gym, and I heard these 3 people next to me, you know, I'm on my bike, and talking about the death penalty, and this guy said, if somebody killed my kid, you just let me at him. And I saw that same energy. This vengeance, it's very primal, I believe it's very human, it's probably in most human beings, but it is the lower part of our souls and ourselves and our beings, so here's what I think. It's a fine thing that the country is beginning to debate this. We were talking earlier, there probably is a blip in the polls. I mean, you probably 20 years ago, because the whole country was engaged in a dialogue and debate that was not just controlled by the conservative end of the spectrum. There was far more liberal and even radical ideas that were really wrestling about how to have social accountability and how to have social change, and we, you know, could we eliminate poverty, and could structures of society change? Institutions and ideas were on the table 25 years ago as a result of the 60s, in the 70s. And, you know, the death penalty was not a big issue then. It was not an up front and center issue, but we were talking, probably there were more people who were against it 25 years ago, and then steadily it's probably grown. But, you know, it's still probably a majority of people who are in favor of the death penalty in this country. I like to think that this newest debate will actually engage people at a deeper level, because in a country that is the richest country in the history of the world, that has the most people in prison, that has a public education system that's failing, that has an environment that's failing, that has the widest gap between rich and poor of any advanced industrial country and of any country, of this country, in this country's history, that has a whole lot of issues that go to justice and equality, and you talk about fallibility of the death penalty. It's going to, in a society where inequality is so ingrained, it's going to be unequally distributed,
right.
And so you have to at least look at it that way. But I like to think that, you know, somebody was saying it's, you know, it's Iraq and Iran and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and essentially countries not known for their great enlightenment and democratic values that hold tight to this, whereas virtually every other advanced, certainly democratic country has abolished the death penalty. You know, if you talk in France about the death penalty, they think you're wacko. It's so marginal. The idea that you would have the death penalty and that you would have this strong public support of it is so marginal. And in this country, you're marginal if you're against it. And I guess what I'm saying is that I think it's partly because I think issues of inequality and of social action and a kind of resurgence of activism, you know, whether you look at a resurgent labor movement or whether you look at those demonstrations against the WTO or whether you look at the ongoing vibrancy of gay and lesbian activism, the reality is I think we're seeing an upsurge of questions about issues of justice and fairness, which I think we'll see more and more of. This issue, the death penalty, I hope people start talking about the heaviness on the heart, because when people start talking from their kind of what I would call sort of their lower selves, you know, from the vindictive, get even, get back place in the face of evidence that says that it doesn't act as a deterrent, in the face of evidence that says that innocent people die, in the face of evidence that says it's unequally applied, you know, and basically there's racism and certainly a class bias involved in it. So, but not even on those issues, but just on the issue of the heaviness of the heart. Do we want to have a country that stands with those countries in terms of the values of how we put justice out? And I would also say that I think we need to look at, you know, the prison population, the growing prison population, the whole issue of sort of the criminalization of poverty and a generation of black and brown youth who are forced to drop out of lousy schools and given no options and end up going to jail and being more likely to end up, you know, on death row. But if you just look at this issue and you talk to the people who are in favor of it, I think it's like we stoop to the level of people who are the murderers.
Well, it's the same way with any killing in a funny way. I mean, when we look at the guys that come back from wars, whether we thought it was a good war like World War II, or ambivalent like Korea, or a bad war like Vietnam, the toll even on those who are allowed to kill without it being a sin, who are trained and taught and told to kill, in addition to our being engaged by virtue of knowing through the media that someone's going to be executed and someone's going to be executed and etc., that calls upon us. I mean, I'm fascinated that these same dykes who've been hanging around a pool every July 4th for years, this year are talking about the death penalty. That the same people in the gyms where we've been going for years, this year are talking about the death penalty.
And I want to say something, because I think good people really disagree on this issue, and I think there needs to be real education about the realities of it, some of which we've talked about already, because what I experienced around that pool was that there were people who felt afraid to say they were in favor of it because they felt they were in a generally liberal environment that has often stifled debate and discussion, the kind of political correctness, you know, where it's an assumption. If you believe on one issue, you believe on the others. And so there was a coming out of the closet of those people who were sort of adamantly in favor of the death penalty. And I just hope that the conversation that happens in the light of facts, data, that I don't think people have. Just as I don't think they know that every day LAPD is rounding up black and brown kids all over cities in this country and treating them, I mean, we're beginning to see it because of the Rampart scandal in LA and the New York police under more scrutiny and so forth, but I think this is a broader issue of how values in this society get codified in law and how ideas about fairness, compassion, and justice, and, you know, including the response that people have to violence and to violent crime in a society that sanctions violence from the top.
Well, it's interesting to me, this is also an aspect of difference, and I wonder if you might you know, jump in at any time. As I tell people, it's a talk show, not a be quiet show. But this notion of difference that informs the way people think about us. We are different, therefore lesser. I mean, we've seen all of these laws about us. My experience sitting on the Public Safety Committee for years in the Assembly is that there's this same notion of difference about good people and bad people. There's us, and then there's criminals. And somehow if somebody's a criminal, they don't deserve the same kind of justice.
Well, there's another way of looking at it, maybe. I think people value security, and they hate being afraid. I mean, this is the inevitable, I think, result of fear because crime is going up. When I started in my office, we were 5 attorneys and had over 1,000 cases. This was like a decade ago, right? And now we have 22 attorneys. This is not even on the death penalty cases, on just the general crimes. We have 3,500 cases. I mean, that's how much crime has escalated.
It's not just crime, though. It's criminalizing so many things. It's passing so many statutes with heavier and heavier penalties. I mean, we look at the drug laws, I mean, where the answer again and again and again has been another statute, make it a federal law, make it a state law, make it a heavier law, lock them up and throw away the key. I mean, that's why we really have wanted to say, wait a minute, you can't change anything at that point. The bad thing has already happened. If we want society to be different, we need to go way, way back to the beginning. Just as Torie was saying, and as you're saying, I mean, the point is, why is it in the legislature in California that there are bills that have been introduced to provide money and guidance and a mandate that there needs to be anti-discrimination, let's all get along with each other type education with funding attached to make sure that every young person in this state has some basic tools for dealing with anger and better ways to understand each other so that they don't grow up hating each other. Those bills languish. Meanwhile, the penalty enhancement statutes pass and become law. Your wonderful bill to add sexual orientation to the education code, to make it, you know, clear within California law that young people should not be facing harassment or discrimination based on sexual orientation in the schools, didn't quite make it. Just a vote short. We were all watching that going, how can this be? How can sane people not support this bill? We're talking about children here. Well, it did pass at the point that a couple of members of the legislature were able to see it and describe it to their constituents as being related to hate crime, to criminal law. It was done with a reference to the penal code. Instead of using the word sexual orientation, it cross-referenced to the hate crime statute, so that made it a criminal bill and enhanced the penalty bill, and it passed and became law.
Brilliant tactic. I have.
Well, yes, it was, and in fact, the coverage is more comprehensive and covers a number of important things that wouldn't be true otherwise. For example, discrimination based on gender wouldn't have been covered otherwise, and that's a very important thing for lots of young people who aren't conforming exactly to people's stereotyped notions of maleness or femaleness. It's in fact a wonderful result, but the mechanism says something powerful about where people are in California, that those elected representatives felt that they were at risk of losing their seat.
Well, but the tools are very limited. I mean, in a way, Torie touched on this because it's a question of how do you respond. And when Jay talks about fear, I mean, if you were solving this, the death penalty is a final way. It is clean to people. It is, you know, it has closure. education, how do we know that's going to work?
There are other ways to get
You know?
closure. One of the, I mean, in California, we're lucky enough to have something called LWOP, life without possibility of parole, and it works. And you can put 3 people in prison for life for the cost of one person going through death penalty, a capital case, being convicted, and then being on death row and then being executed. That's a gigantic savings if we used LWOP. That protects society. That brings closure. I'm reminded of a wonderful study in a broader way, getting away from the gay issue and the anti-bias issue. A wonderful study in Detroit, where a bunch of inner city kids were focused on by parents and teachers starting with preschool, and it went all the way through school 28 years later. This is a 28-year study. How often do you get a 28-year study? 28-year study. The amount of crime, first of all, the median income of these kids was substantially higher. The amount of crime was a mere fraction of the kids in the control groups that didn't get this focus. We could spend some of the money we save in the death penalty by focusing like that on kids. To me, that's the beginning of a solution. I would like to have less of a job. You know? And I don't know what it is that can be done in the legislature to get people focused differently, but putting some finality through the death penalty, building more prisons, some of that is necessary for the safety of society. But it goes beyond what's necessary for the safety of society, and ultimately the safety of society is ensured when we focus on kids. I have a little saying framed in my study at home that it says it's easier to build a child than to repair an adult. And to me, that should be the focus.
There has to be a real paradigm shift in this country, and that's what I'm hoping is beginning to happen in the last couple of years, with just a little bit of sort of random resurgence of a new conversation, or at least a re-percolating conversation. There has to be a paradigm shift. I mean, since the 3 strikes law was passed in California, 40,000 people have been thrown in jail for 20 years or 25 years to life. 3/4 of them are black or brown. 3/4 of them are drug addicts or alcoholics. Now, let alone Jay's wonderful study from Detroit that if there had been intervention with early childhood programs, that many of those people's lives would have ended up in a different way. But we're talking about thrown in jail for stealing a pizza on the 3rd offense. I mean, these are not murderers. We're not talking about the folks that who were facing, the death penalty. But the reality is we've created this criminalization of poverty is the word that I've been using for it, where in this society that suddenly becomes so obsessed with wealth, and I mean, not that this country has always had a healthy regard for money and the accumulation of wealth, but I mean, this in the last 20 years, the kind of economic numbers that we've seen, and I am telling you, people don't know this, and they don't have the facts. It's as if the data points haven't been getting out to the public, whether it's just simply the facts on the 3 strikes and on this law that everybody voted for, but the actual impact on people's lives of a young father or brother or sister, for that matter, being thrown in jail for life for stealing a pizza. This is ridiculous. There are very few Americans who would support that. Most Americans, I really believe, what they might say in a poll on the death penalty aside, really want equality of opportunity to be distributed among people, and they don't want the kid who murders somebody to get out, but the kid who steals a pizza, they want to give him a chance, and especially when they know that they're a drug addict or an alcoholic, they want treatment, and that keeping them in jail for a year is a lot more expensive than some education programs or than drug treatment. It's like we got to turn society's priorities upside down.
Well,
it's very hard to get the facts out correctly, though. I mean, there are lots of facts now about crime going down, homicides diminishing. You've been reading those. It's nationwide. That's attributed to some extent to 3 strikes because so many people are in prison. Now, but see, that's a misuse. But that's a misuse of statistics, because it's now becoming clear that was a little bit of a dip, and it's like this again this last year. And where is the primary problem? Juveniles. So we're just, if anything, it was maybe demographic, because us baby boomers were getting too old and too tired to commit as many. That's absolutely
No,
right.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing we need to recognize is when you said it gives people closure, I think a lot of people think of it that way, that it can be really a false promise. Because if in fact it doesn't deter crime, and we're not focusing on what really causes problems because we're so busy focused on these laws that don't solve the problem, we're not putting our attention where it should be. And that's part of why I come back to the studies that show how unfair it is and how inaccurate it is, because that helps people understand that it's a false promise. There was a recent study just came out by some folks at Columbia University. 10-year study of the states that have had the death penalty starting in '73. That discovered, looked at all the death penalty cases. 68% of the cases in which death penalty was imposed, that was reversed based on errors. 68% errors, and that's only the ones where the appeal was successful in pointing out the errors. If there weren't good lawyers handling the appeal, who knows what the statistic would have been. In the same way that we know, and a number of studies have showed this, that bias is always at play, so that it's not fair. It's hugely disproportionate by race. 2 years ago, another study, this one was done by the Death Penalty Information Center, which focuses on these issues exclusively, found, looking nationwide, that if you're a black defendant as opposed to a white defendant for the same crime, 4 times more likely to have the death penalty imposed. And we've seen that in our work. We were involved recently in a case out of Texas, where so many of these cases seem to happen, actually, quite disproportionate, where this was a case of a gay man who was being prosecuted for killing his lover. His lawyer, court-appointed lawyer, was asleep during a significant part of the trial and never made any objection to all of the grossly inappropriate comments made by the prosecution about him as a gay man, including his closing urging that death penalty should be imposed because certainly life spent in prison wouldn't be much of a penalty for a gay man, because of course we all know what goes on in prisons. Horrifying, horrifying. There's no reason to think that case is unique. We know otherwise. So if it's unfair, and if it's riddled with mistakes, how can it possibly give people the security that people desperately want?
Doesn't it take a long-range view to look at children instead of trying to do a quick fix and find a magic bullet like the death penalty? And can I ask you a question? I mean, this is your talk show, not mine, but may I ask?
I think it's ours today. It's good.
Right. But posing at least a rhetorical question to you. With term limits, how can we find legislators who have long-term views when the short-term interest doesn't lead them there?
Well, it's not possible unless we work to keep filling the chairs with people who, you know, sort of randomly chosen, who might have these attitudes in an era of term limits or not. The issue is not what legislators feel. The issue is popular opinion. And it's interesting, the range of work that the 4 of us do represent different ways that the law is impacted. And I know, Torie, you might say, well, you know, my work's not with the law, but it is, because the grassroots organizing, the organizing of the kinds of organizations that you fund, are about attitude as much as anything else.
Well, we're about, I mean, the work that I do is about, and always have done in different ways, is about changing institutions and about changing ideas.
Right,
and
exactly.
ultimately about trying to kind of reshape social institutions in a more progressive direction, a broad word, but basically means, I think, to reinvigorate democracy in this country and pluralism. And what I think is beginning to happen, and what I think the death penalty, I don't know that we'll ever get rid of it, or that we'll ever have a majority of people who are adamantly and passionately against it. But I do think you could have a more educated public that would know the truth and not the ideology that sort of flares out of people's, you know, it's like a magic bullet, a quick fix. It's like a product to solve your need for, you know, for get back. And it's all, you know, it's sort of like having this issue over here when what's really going on is much more complicated. And just as I think we sometimes, you know, demonize the police and the police demonize the gang kids, and the gang kids demonize the police. You're asking the police to solve very complex problems, and you're asking kids to somehow pull themselves up by their bootstraps out of transgenerational poverty and no jobs and and public schools where 2/3 of them, you know, drop out. These are big problems, and the quick fix of the death penalty is not going to solve them. And sometimes I think that's what social policy has become in the last 20 years. It's instant. It's not just short
like
term,
everything else.
but it's like everything else, and it doesn't match reality.
Right, we
and
got
I
McDonald's,
think people,
Mac paper, Mac justice.
right, Mac justice. That's
I mean,
exactly
truly.
what the death penalty is. And violence is rampant in this country, and people are afraid. And there's a good reason that people are looking for solutions. The solutions are the wrong solutions. And
Well, death penalty is like what we see in the movies, good violence. I'm putting that in quotes.
Right, yeah.
Because the notion is you want to stop the violent person, you have to use violence. That's what all the movies do. You don't ever win against a violent assailant by talking them out of something. And so we have no example about how to resolve conflict except through violence. So all we're left with is good violence and bad violence, and people put the death penalty in the kind of, gee, unfortunate, but we have to shoot back
And that's especially
category.
a problem when there are questions about the mental capacity
Right.
of the prisoners, of the perpetrators, and there is a grave question about that in a lot of cases. Some of them have IQs that wouldn't allow them to attend regular schools, and some of them maybe they do understand under legal terms that they shouldn't have done something, but we have lost our principle in this country of not punishing people for their status and of being mentally ill. We don't deal with mental illness very well, as you know, and that's part of the problem.
I would just say, I absolutely agree with that. And I don't want to lose sight of what a big thing we're asking of our fellows, and what a big shift we're talking about. I mean, Lambda experienced quite a lot of negative response when we took this public position. As I said, we don't take positions that often, and it was in a highly charged public moment, which was why we felt it was incumbent to do so and to say we need to have a positive vision. And it was exactly what Matthew Shepard's parents said. We need to envision what we want society to be and think how we can get there. And at this moment when many in society would expect us as people within the gay and lesbian community to say, yeah, this was an injury to us, we want ours back, that it was an important moment to say, that's not how we want to operate, because we can imagine a different way of interacting, and that if we can rise above those emotions and make sure that we have a system that's based on fairness and accuracy and on the place we want to go. We know that imposition of the death penalty is never going to be a step toward the place where we want ourselves to be as a group. And so that's really, let's put something positive in that place, and especially for all of us as a community to try to embrace that as a value, because really it is about reaching over the divisions among us. As you said before, and I think it couldn't possibly be truer, that we wouldn't impose that penalty. If we were the witness, we wouldn't be able to carry it out to somebody that we felt connected to personally. And so it is about color, and it is about class or sexual orientation or something else that enables us to see that person as not connected to us, and to put all of our fears and our discomfort and our frustrations, whether it's based on economics or based on any number of things, put all our frustrations in that person, and then kill them.
We don't
Scapegoating.
have to move very far to be on the right road, though. I mean, the compromise in the state legislature in California was brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, people are still being punished for that kind of crime. It just moved to what we call LWOP.
The problem, of course, is that there were some who voted for the lesser punishment because they didn't think that it was as great a crime to kill a gay person. I mean, there are a bunch of right-wing people in my legislature as well. But you started to say about
Well, I just think scapegoating in this country has become a national pastime. I mean, it's really easy to scapegoat, you know, developmentally disabled, poor, black people in prison. I mean, it's really easy to write them off. And I think what Lambda did, I mean, I found it stunning. It was a level of moral leadership, and it wasn't today when the conversation is on the agenda.
Right.
It was 2 years ago, before all this conversation was publicly held about the death penalty. It was a kind of moral leadership that we don't see enough. It's in our community.
But the fact that the debate was had and it led to that decision, I thought was extremely beneficial to the community.
And I should say, there were other national gay and lesbian organizations who joined Lambda and who did this together.
Right, I'm sure NGLTF and other progressive groups.
And of course the ACLU has been a long time opponent of the death penalty, going back a very, very long time. But this really was an important moment, and I think many of us felt within the legal department when we talked about this was that it was a special moment in history because of the injury that so many of us felt with Matthew Shepard's parents. To take that moment to say, we will think about the civil rights implications of this institution,
Right.
and take this moment to stress where we would like society to be.
It's so interesting because what you were saying really was there are values greater than equality. We're going to give up our moment of being equal to everybody else and make a higher statement that we don't need to be equal in this area.
Or maybe that we would like society to conceive of equality differently, and we want to take a step in that direction because we know people are watching. And in this moment, it's a proud moment to be able to lead toward a different vision of equality.
Right. Equality and vindictiveness isn't necessarily the kind of equality that we're looking for.
Well, that's exactly it. I mean, and that's been the part of the essence of the debate, I think, for our community. But in the larger sense, I mean, I'm very glad to see this discussion starting. Although I never really enjoyed Thanksgiving dinner even before I came out, because it was always that kind of place where you would be having these discussions. You know, the family gets together, they have different political views, and it gets heated, and you think, can't we just have a nice, peaceful Thanksgiving? But I hope this year that no one does.
Yeah.
You know, I hope they're all talking about this around barbecue tables or, you know, whatever people gather around for some intelligent discussion, because this is an essential question.
Right. I think that there's a grave danger, though, that this is not really what's happening at all. That what this is about is a little blip of concern because of DNA testing showing that some people on death row were not really the perpetrators. And most of the people who support the moratoriums on the death penalty, I don't think are against the death penalty. I think they just want to make sure the right person is being executed. So,
but I think as long as the conversation is also about the broader notion that we've been talking about values and that
education of children.
Whether it's education of children, whether it's, you know, any piece of it, I think it's a really positive, it catalyzes a positive conversation. I mean, I have to say, in all my years of working in gay and lesbian freedom, which was 15 years solidly of doing work, you know, I was a queer activist for 15 years. Before that I was an activist on other issues, and after that I'm an activist. But I have to tell you, there was never a conversation about kind of criminal justice issues, about, I mean, we would talk about hate crimes, or we would talk about the gay and lesbian issue. There was never a conversation about sort of I don't know, you know, morality, justice. I mean, there may have been in some places in the legal community, but in the broader community, we were so busy looking at our experiences that we weren't so much linking up with other experiences. And I think history compels us to not have this one kind of shining moral moment that Lambda had 2 years ago, and to not just be kind of searching our own, why is our heart heavy if we're in favor of the death penalty, even though we intellectually are in favor of it. But what is going on in this society? You know, what are the values that get codified into law? Why is there an obsession about throwing people in jail? Why is the prison industry one of the fastest growing industries? Why is prison labor, there was some special on 2020 about the use of prison labor, this growing piece of economic planning? What is going on here?
Well, I'm going to have to stop this because the time is up, and I think leaving us with a number of questions is every bit as good as leaving us with a bunch of answers, which we don't have. But this has been wonderful. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Torie. Thank you for being here. I hope you will have these discussions around every table or water cooler or wherever you are. And I hope that for the benefit of your intellectual health, you'll get used to it.